101.1 FM KFUG Crescent City.
The flowers in the vase that you bought today, staring at the fire for hours.
Welcome to Counterculture Radio. This is your host, Dan Schultz. This week we have Jim Willie, editor of the Hat Trick newsletter and the goldenjackass.com website. I've been following Jim for a while, and I really appreciate the way he has a circumspect view of especially financial matters, but also the political realm. And I think he's going to be very interesting today to listen to about derivatives. And so I've asked Jim to come and explain maybe some of the fundamentals, because it's my belief that a lot of people don't get into prep mode, preparing for whether that's an acute, sudden jolt of lifestyle change or whether it's a slow degradation. I think the fundamentals are that things are going to change and not for the better. So, Jim, welcome to the show.
Oh, good to be on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm really honored. And maybe you could start out by explaining some of the fundamentals of even what a derivative is. I mean, I saw an interview on Wall Street a couple of years ago where they went to Wall Street and asked all these people that work at Morgan Stanley, and nobody could explain what a derivative was.
Well, a derivative is technically a leveraged instrument used in finance where the value of a contract is derived from other assets. And that's what the word derivative comes from. A contract whose value is derived from other assets. Well, think of, for instance, a leveraged mortgage bond. Not the mortgage bond, but a leveraged mortgage bond. Like they call them collateral debt obligations or whatever. But if you've got, say, a 5-to-1 or 7-to-1 leveraged contract on mortgage bonds using borrowed money, you've got a derivative that hangs off the value of mortgages. That's one of the simple ones. Here's another one. An insurance contract for, say, a big bank. Banks like Bank of America, Citigroup, they have bonds. They have bank financial bond. I'm sorry, it didn't come out right. They have bonds that act like financial firm debt securities. Okay? So the banks have their own corporate bonds. There are insurance contracts against default on those bonds. You have other things like the interest rate derivative, which is under my focus. The interest rate derivative is a swap contract of short-term spreads versus long-term spreads, and sounds all kind of exotic. It is. It's a bit of a black box weirdo contract. But what they do with it is very pernicious. We've got 0% money for short-term, and it will not go away. All the talk of raising rates is all BS. It's all propaganda to try to keep the confidence in the dollar strong, and it's withering away. The dollar is going to be rejected globally, and Americans are going to be the last ones to comprehend this. But what they do with the 0% money is they take the free money, they buy treasury bills, the short-term instruments, they buy short-term treasuries, and then hook in the interest rate swap, which converts it to demand for the long-term treasuries, the 15 and 30-year bonds. So with free money, they create demand for the long-term bonds.
And Jim, is this also the way that they are propping up the stock market and the dollar, and they're keeping down the prices of gold and controlling gold and silver? Is this also the free money that the banks are getting? Is that the way that's going on?
Well, they're not using free money to keep down the gold price. They're using free money to prop up the stock market and the bond market. I've heard that between 25 and 50% of the U.S. stock market now is owned by the Federal Reserve and Wall Street banks.
Wow.
So there's no market anymore. I mean, people who believe that the U.S. stock market is doing well are living in a delusion. It's like they fell down the Alice in Wonderland, tube, the big hole, the pit. They're talking to the Cheshire Cat when they're talking to their stockbroker. They have no idea what's going on here. You've got all these derivatives at work. And I was focusing on the interest rate swap contract because they're using the 0% funnel of free money to create bond demand for the treasuries. There are no buyers for U.S. treasuries anymore. It's an asset bubble, the largest in history. And take a look at the tick report. There's almost no buying by our regular creditors. Who's buying U.S. government debt anymore? It's the Fed. We are a third world nation finances, and we've got third world nation central bank. We've got third world nation voter fraud. We've got third world nation militarism. I mean, what's the war going to be next month?
So is China, Japan, all these other countries, is it zero, or did they just decrease their holdings in treasuries?
They're not buying any new treasuries. There's no new buying of treasuries by these foreign countries. Of course, there's a little bit. England buys a little, Japan buys a little, maybe India buys a little. But take a look at the balances, and they're not growing, while some nations like Russia and China are reducing. And I've got news for people who actually believe that China still owns 1.3 trillion in treasury bonds. They don't. These are falsified figures by the U.S. government. There's almost no data by the U.S. government that's correct anymore. The only one that I find to be correct is what are the income tax withholdings from payrolls across the United States employers.
That's the only truthful figure that the government can come up with?
Well, I defy you. Come up with an economic statistic, and I'll explain how it's false. The three main ones that are false are the economic growth with the gross domestic product, GDP, the jobless claims, the jobless rate with non-farm payrolls, and then there's the price inflation. We've had price inflation now since 2007 that's been running pretty steadily at 7, 8, 9%. Yet when they do their calculations, they say that we've got this amount of economic activity and we're going to offset now 1.5 or 2.5% for inflation. So we're left with 3% growth for the economy. Well, subtract 5.
Yeah, right.
Okay, why do we actually, we've got like a law that when you talk about the economy, you must talk about the recovery and put an adjective in front of it, like sluggish recovery.
Right.
Like the long-standing, troublesome recovery that we're in, or the, what I prefer, non-existent fictional recovery.
Yeah.
There is none. And now in Q1, we had a surge downward, so it's a minus 2.7% or something recession in the first quarter. Well, subtract 4. Mm-hmm. You've got a minus 7% recession in the first quarter. And now they're telling us that you get a big surge of economic growth in the second quarter, yet take a closer look and you see that it's all inventory buildup. Are they going to sell that inventory, or is it going to sit there, rot, and then be liquidated? No, every single major economic statistic in the United States is false. And that's why shadow government statistics is doing quite well with John Williams. I rely on his figures. He's got 23% unemployment.
Yeah.
He's got 5, 6, 7% consistent price inflation. Well, now it's rising.
I'm with you on that, and I found it funny that you you sought out the only truthful statistic that you could find from the government, and I think that I think even the average person, I mean, the average person goes to work and they do things and they don't have time, or maybe they don't have the capacity to comprehend the scope of this problem. But even the average person, if you go to a restaurant and you talk to the waitress or you talk to the guy who's fixing your car, he doesn't trust anything the government says. Everybody just says, well, yeah, inflation is at 3% or whatever they're saying, and they go to the grocery store and everything they buy is more expensive. And for that matter, even things like President Obama winning the Nobel Peace Prize. The whole system is Orwellian and wrong. So, and I don't think that the trust has been eroded on maybe even a collective consciousness level. But that's one of the reasons why I think your information, your perspective is so valuable, because I've always appreciated the way you connect the dots. And I think for the average person, for our audience who may not be average, trying to wrap your head around what's really going on in the world. Where do you find that? You don't find that on CNN.
Well, let me connect some dots for a few very recent events and do so quickly and briefly because they're really important. There's been a giant legal prosecution against National Bank of Paris. It's called BNP Paribas. We fined them $9 billion and claimed that they were involved with breaking the sanctions for banking with Iran, Sudan, and Cuba. Take a closer look and you see that they were actually helping other nations to dump treasury bonds. And take another closer look and you get your smoking gun. BNP Paribas was removed from having a US dollar trading license. Well, gee, why would they do that? Because they were helping foreign countries to dump treasury bonds. We're defending the dollar here. Okay, why did there's another angle. BNP Paribas had to declare admission of guilt. And there's a lot of talk now that they're going to be folded under Societe Generale, the big French bank, that is part of the cabal. They've got huge short positions on gold. They've got lots and lots of Forex trades that help the London and New York Wall Street bankers. So, okay, attack the big Parisian bank, BNP Paribas, to stop the treasury dumping.
Yes.
Okay, now, a few years ago, they attacked UBS, Union Bank Switzerland. And now the U.S. pretty much controls the bank. So now they're going after Credit Suisse. And again, they had them sign a letter of admission of guilt. And the talk is they're going to fold it under UBS control. Look behind the scenes and you see a lot of Arab gold accounts there. So they're trying to steal the Arab gold. There's a huge divorce that we could cover here shortly with the Saudis. They're stealing the Saudi and Arab gold sitting in Switzerland, and Credit Suisse was not cooperating. So they nailed them on lots of tax evasion secret accounts with American citizens. And if they can fold it into UBS, they can steal the rest of the Arab gold.
It sounds like war.
We've got a financial war. That's why I call my first report each month the Global Money War Report. I changed it from the macroeconomic report in 2008 when Lehman hit, and I realized, okay, my forecast for 3 or 4 years of a bank system failure, a housing market bust, and a U.S. economic systemic failure have all come to pass. Let's change the name to the Global Money War Report because this so-called global financial crisis is more like a global financial war declared by the U.S. government on all nations, including allies, to defend the dollar.
Yeah, and I read your recent information on Germany. Now, this seems to me to be really huge because Germany is not only an ally, a big ally, but they're also the big financial engine of Europe and the Eurozone. And what you talk about with Germany sounds as big as anything.
If the euro currency loses Germany, the euro will die.
Yeah.
If NATO loses Germany, the NATO alliance will die. If the Germans start working with the Russians and Chinese on a gold currency, the dollar will die. That's the importance of Germany. They are the heart of Europe. Now, the U.S. is pushing Germany into a corner. They're basically saying, go to war against Russia, or at least a lot of sanctions, which are financial war.
Mm-hmm.
And we, as the United States, will supply you of all that energy, all that oil and gas that Russia was supplying. It's a moronic lie. 40% of all German natural gas usage comes from Russia. Are we going to replace all that? I don't think so. 30% of all the crude oil usage in Germany comes from Russia. Are we going to replace all that? I don't think so. So what we're doing with Germany is telling them, go to the sanctions, create this enemy, bugaboo of Russia, which is your gigantic trade partner. Go to war with them. Go to financial war, hot war, whatever war. Go to war, which is the American favorite pastime.
Yes.
Of fascist America. Go to war with Russia in order to protect the dollar. Do not replace the dollar with the gold standard for trade, banking, which is what Russia and China want to do. This whole war in Ukraine is over defending the dollar. Russia wants to get rid of the dollar in trade settlement. What do we do with Saddam when he did the same thing?
Right, when he started selling oil in something other than the dollar.
He was selling it in euros for about 3 years, and finally the United States had enough, and they thought they'd go in, and while they were at it, clean out all the weapons of mass destruction, the toxic chemical weapons that the Bush family sold to Saddam.
Yeah.
And they found it all. 10 warehouses full. I had a very strange interaction with two guys, Brian and Mark. Last names aren't important. Well, Brian, I met them in 2009. They were going to do something interesting for me regarding a second newsletter, more like a travel guide for, the expat. And I decided not to do it. But Brian came from Iraq. He said, I was in Iraq last year. I worked for, no, not last year. I was working in Iraq for 3 years. I think he was there in 03, 4, and 5. And I said, oh my gosh, what were you doing, in uniform? And he said, no, I was working for Halliburton.
Yeah.
He said, oh, we found all the weapons of mass destruction, chemical, toxic stuff. You wouldn't believe the stuff. He said, all the stuff that Saddam used against the Kurdistan rebels, tribal units in northeast Iraq, the Kurds. He said a lot of stuff left over from the Iran war in the 80s. And really, the U.S. didn't want to see it revealed as having U.S. markings on them.
Right. We know that they had them because we have the receipts.
Yeah. Well, they also have a lot of photographs with Rumsfeld and Bush and Saddam, their buddy. So they attacked their buddy because their buddy started selling oil in euros. And that's exactly what Russia is going to do. They're going to sell their natural gas and crude oil to the Germans and the other Europeans. And they're not ready to do it in rubles. So they're in a bit of a bind. And the United States went in there and kind of interrupted things because they were planning to do it in the next few months, but not right away. They're still not ready to do it right away. And my guess is that Russia's going to sell a lot of energy and take either euros or yuan, Chinese currency or the European currency. That's what's coming. But Germany...
So you think Germany's going to switch horses midstream and go with the BRIC nations? I mean, we've already stole their gold. I mean, that has to piss them off. But that's a huge move.
They don't want economic destruction any more than you do. When we invite them to go into the Russian sanctions, we're telling them cut off your Russian trade. Did you know that there are over 3,000 German companies doing business in Russia?
Is it bigger? Is their economic connection with Russia bigger than the United States?
No. But their connection with China and Russia together is quite large, and it's going to grow. It's going to grow leaps and bounds. I like to identify. No, let's go back to this main point. we're asking Germany to go to economic war with Russia, cut off their energy supply, and enjoy a destruction of their economy, or work with the BRICS nations, Russia and China, and develop a gold standard. What do you think they're going to choose? We don't give our allies good choices. We say go to war, go to sanctions, which will destroy your economy, and keep your support with us. The dollar is a contaminated, cancerous currency now, and people look at me sideways. I meet people, in clubs and restaurants, sports clubs, sports bars, and other places, and they say, "Are you kidding me? The dollar's contaminated currency." I said, "What is quantitative easing? You guys need to wake up. Quantitative easing is hyper-monetary inflation. They're printing money to cover between $40 and $80 billion a month. So it's between $500 billion and $1 trillion a year. Do you think this is good policy? What are the consequences to the dollar? It's turned cancerous."
Almost by definition. I mean, I'm in healthcare. Cancer is something that has this. Well, it's mimicking the unlimited growth model, which is cancer if I ever heard it. But unlimited growth and creating in this quantitative easing and creative money is equally as cancerous.
Well, think of it this way. Go back to the 1970s and 80s and 60s when economics was taught. They taught us that nations that do unchecked monetary inflation to cover their debt destroy the capital and destroy their economies. Why is the U.S. different?
Yeah.
We're the same. We're just bigger.
All fiat currencies, you can look it up on Wikipedia, all fiat currencies in the history of finance have always failed.
Well, let me explain the vicious cycle mechanism that is destroying the U.S. economy. It's not stimulus. It's a wet blanket that gives savers nothing. Plus, it's a capital destroyer. Because here's the mechanism. Financial firms and central banks and even entire sovereign nations come up with a policy to protect themselves against this cancerous action against the dollar. We're printing money to cover the dollar's debt, the government's debt, because there are no more legitimate in volume creditors anymore. We're doing what the banana republics used to do that we read about. So these countries and these financial firms hedge by buying up copper mines, by buying up energy deposits, by buying up gold and silver, by buying up lots and lots of hard assets, properties, commercial buildings, farmland. They're buying physical, tangible, hard assets, they call them. In doing so, they raise the cost structure for the entire global economy, not just the U.S. In Egypt, for instance, a year and a half ago, they had a 60% inflation in 1 year for their food prices. That's why they had the revolt. Yeah. It was not about jailing of Islamic opponents. It was not about new rights and reforms. It was about food prices, and the U.S. press lied about it. So we're raising the whole cost structure of the world, and because of economic liquidations and deterioration, you're seeing companies liquidate. So how can a clothing store raise its prices when its costs go up when their competitors are liquidating? So you don't have the firm price control on final product, and you have rising costs. So in the first round, you see companies close and shut down business segments that aren't profitable. All the machines go into a room and go into the off position. They're mothballed with sheets poured over them. Okay, that's your capital retirement. So people earn less money who are laid off. As the system reacts to fewer buyers and consumers out there, more stores in the mall nearby shut down. And a third of the mall is empty. Yeah. No tenants looking for tenants.
All over the country.
All over the country. That's second and third cycle. So what you're seeing is a degradation of the economy from capital destruction caused by the QE so-called Federal Reserve stimulus. It's not stimulus. It's stimulus only to Wall Street. But they like to think, well, let's tell the Main Street residents like you and me that it's stimulus, because if you're dumb enough, you'll believe them.
Yes. So now we have this massive, I've heard numbers of 1.2 quadrillion. Is that right?
I hear 1.4, 1.2. What's a couple hundred trillion among
Exactly. So we have this massive new bubble in derivatives, which I've heard, what is it? Chris Mortensen said that, all of these instruments are a claim on an asset. I kind of like that description, that you have assets like a shovel and a solar panel, and then you have the claim on the asset. So these bets, like you're talking about, these interest rate swaps, which nobody understands, including in part me, are maybe a claim on the asset. So we have, just claims and claims and claims, layers and layers of them on basic assets, which I guess that's the reason why it can't work. So this whole bubble, these claims on assets, does that sound right to you, Jim?
Well, yeah. Let me explain the 2005 Bush Bankruptcy Reform Act. It had two parts. I'll explain the individual one, and then I'll explain the corporate one. You weren't told about the corporate one. You're only told about the individual one. And what it meant was that you could not, if you were a bankrupt individual, you could not declare Chapter 7, wipe out your taxes, wipe out your debt, put all your assets on the table. They all get matched up. The creditors are given 10, 15, 20, 25 cents on the dollar, and you walk away clean. That's gone. That's gone. And that was part of one of the best things about the United States bankruptcy, a new fresh start. Instead, they give you a new enslaved start. Chapter 13 was made the only option, which means you had to restructure your debt. You put your debts on the table, you put your income and assets on the table, you work with your creditors, you restructure your debt, and you work out maybe a lower balance on your debts, on your credit cards, and you retain all of your tax obligations. So you become a debt slave.
Yes.
For years to come. If you lose your job, you're a permanent debt slave. That's the individual. The corporate side is much uglier and received almost zero publicity. Here's how it works. Think of your bank account. Let's just say you got a bank account at Bank of America. And you got a good-sized bank account. You got CDs and whatever else. You got some passbook savings, and let's just say you got 100,000 in there. Now, a lot of people don't have 100,000, but I'm making an argument here. Suppose you have 100,000 in savings at Bank of America. Well, your CDs are not your property. Those are considered unsecured loans to the bank. I'm not making this up. Your savings are considered unsecured loans to the bank, which means you sit secondary to their derivatives. The derivatives that they hold are, I'll just try to describe them a little bit later, but they've got their little instruments acting as a platform. Think of it as a foundation for the bank to sit on. And all those derivative contracts, which are in a lot of trouble, are considered the opposite. They are secured assets. What are they secured by? They're secured by your bank account. So when you think you've got a bank account at Bank of America and you can withdraw it anytime you want, even if they fail because it's insured by the FDIC, you're wrong. You forgot to read the 2005 Bankruptcy Reform Act. If the Bank of America goes dead and fails, all their derivatives are first in line. Your deposits are second in line and will vanish.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes the laws like that make me wonder if debtor prisons aren't fast on the way.
Well, they are. Some people think FEMA camps might be just that. I'm hoping that they can be new residences for the bankers and their entire extended families.
Yes. That's a good idea.
Let me explain, Dan, the platform, the phony platform of derivatives, because this is a very interesting sequence, and if it doesn't explain the substance of it, it'll explain instead the function of it. Okay, I was working at Digital Equipment Corporation in the 1980s. It was a very nice place to work. It was crazy, and it had a death event in early 1990s, but I was there in 1984 when Intel made a very crucial decision. Intel, the chip company, made a decision to send all their fab plants, their chip fabrication, we call them fabs, all their fabrication plants were sent to the Pacific Rim. And we thought among ourselves, this is not good. I mean, there were other companies or other business segments and sectors that were starting to send more and more, like the textile industry years before the 80s. They were going out of the Carolinas and off to India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. Okay, the textile industry was largely lost. Well, now we were beginning to lose the technology industry, and it was a very important growth sector for the U.S. economy. Now, I like to keep in mind all the time my economics background. It wasn't, 12 courses or anything, but it was 3 or 4. And I studied a lot. I read Wall Street Journal. I read Barron's, and I realized this is not good. A lot of other technology firms had some relocation of their fab plants and other manufacturing and other functions, like Taiwan realized a sudden surge in research and development. They've got a lot of brain power in Taiwan. All right, so in the mid-'80s, we had the outsourcing, which, in my opinion, in rough terms, removed legitimate income and replaced it with the need for more asset bubbles and debt dependence in the United States. It only took a few years. Black Monday, 1987, October, big stock market plunge. Very few people realize the cause and effect of outsourcing from the U.S. economy and the manufacturing sectors. All kinds of manufacturing types went to Asia and other points outside the United States, including, we had upcoming was NAFTA. So Mexico was already there, but Mexico increased this phenomenon. So you had the Black Monday event in the late 80s after the early 80s had the beginning of outsourcing. It was from insolvency of businesses, increased debt levels, and all kinds of other problems that I don't wish to describe. So what followed that? What followed was in the Clinton-Rubin administration, starting in 1992, the banks went insolvent and decided to come up with a phony foundation in their derivatives. It was a mass of different derivatives. There were Forex derivatives that had contracts based on the dollar. The euro wasn't around at the time. On the dollar and other currencies. And let's keep trading these contracts among ourselves in Wall Street and produce a lifted value off them so that these multi-trillion-dollar contracts could serve as a foundation for the U.S. banking system. We're talking early 1990 decade. The U.S. banking system went insolvent. It was worth nothing. We didn't have the advantage of all the narcotics coming from Afghanistan to lift up through narco money laundering the New York banks. They had to rely on their own devices, so they came up with the derivatives. Now, we've heard a lot about flash trading in Wall Street and how 80% of New York Stock Exchange volume comes from flash trading, computer trading, algorithm trading, algos, whatever you want to call them. That's the same thing. One bank sells a bank stock to another or an S&P stock to another, and they keep bidding it up, 6 straight bids up, and then finally 1 or 2 go down. They're elevating and levitating these derivative contracts just like they elevate and levitate the stock valuations. It's a phony, I call it a spinning, whirling dervish, which spins so fast and so hard and with such incredible degree of these crazy contracts that the illusion is that it has mass. It has none. This is what the U.S. banking system sits on. It sits on somewhere between $700 trillion and $1,400 trillion worth of phony derivatives. And AIG was absorbed into the U.S. government for a simple reason. It was the main merchant of derivatives of one particular kind called credit default swaps, which are insurance contracts against corporate bonds, often financial firms.
Yes.
Fannie Mae was being dumped by the Chinese after we reneged on a gold lease that was on the back end of the 1999 most favored nation granted status. So we promised to help them build up with foreign investment their industrial base, and they lent us a bunch of Mao Zedong era gold. And it's very complicated, the sequence. It took me a few years to figure it all out and to get sourced information on it. But we reneged on the gold lease and became an enemy state for the Chinese around 2007, precisely when they dumped mortgage bonds to cause the subprime crisis. The subprime was not homegrown. China pulled the rug out after we reneged on the gold lease that Wall Street does not want you to know about.
We never hear about this stuff either.
Right.
It just doesn't. Well, I'm surprised that the amount of information, even things that make mainstream press in Europe, in other parts of the world, that are about us, don't come up in our Mockingbird media. It's appalling.
We have the most controlled and distorted press in the entire industrialized world. What I have an advantage of with this newsletter is not simple, online access to 15 different major journals like Russia Today or Al Jazeera or UK Telegraph or India Economic Times. I have access to a lot of things just like other people do in the United States. I've got access to other things, though, and it's information from sources. And the sources are telling me about a lot of different things. For instance, all across the Middle East and Europe, all across Asia and Europe are news stories about a huge, huge oil discovery off the Palestine coast.
That's news.
What does that motivate?
yeah, war.
So Israel has what they call the floating Tamar platform. It's got innovative technology. It's not anchored. It's called floating because it floats. But it's an enormous platform that drills offshore, deep under the Mediterranean, for oil and gas. And I'm told it's going to be a lifeline for the Israeli economy and produce tremendous amount of surplus revenue. And it's all tied into Gazprom. So Israel and Russia are economic allies. Now, there's an extension to what Israel discovered about 5 years ago or so, 7 years ago. The floating platform was, I think, built around 2005, 6, 7, with some excellent technology that rivals what the Norwegians do. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Norwegians did it, because they're the best. They're the best in offshore platforms. The Discovery Channel and a lot of those historical type channels, they show the development of the Norwegian technology in the North Sea. It's very fascinating how they drop down a huge tower that's maybe even a quarter of a mile deep onto the seabed. All right, so the Israelis discovered this huge deposit, but then there were more extensions of the deposit north to Lebanon and Syria. That might motivate war, I would think.
Yeah.
All right. Now, recently, in the last several months, the extension of the oil discovery went toward the Palestine coast. And what I'm hearing is that Israel wants it all. Why not? They got a powerful military and they got a powerful ally in the United States. So, hey, let's go to war. Let's do what we do best. Kill people. All right. I don't want to talk about that much anymore, but if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about a common thread between Cyprus, Syria, and Ukraine.
I'd like to hear it.
It's called Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, basic question. March of 2013, we had the Cyprus event and the threat and model of the bail-in confiscation for bank accounts. Has there been any Western bank account that has done a bail-in confiscation?
I don't believe so.
Then what was Cyprus all about?
Oh.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Silence.
Yes.
If it was not about bail-in confiscation, then there had to be something rather important that did happen. And I'll explain what I've come to learn. And bear in mind, I don't have the complete picture. I have a rather full picture that's not complete. It's very much not known in the U.S. public, nor in the financial circles, that Cyprus was used by the Russian central bank and their entire big bank system as a clearinghouse window for the entire set of transactions with the West. So let's lock down Cyprus to try to shut off Russia. Furthermore, Gazprom Bank is a very large Cyprus-based bank. That's where they were pocketing and depositing all the European accounts for payments for Gazprom gas. So let's threaten that. Furthermore, Cyprus was a location for a lot of Kremlin conversion of treasury bonds into gold bullion.
Yes.
So let's shut that down.
And at the same time, Cyprus was probably, it seems to me, a staging ground, a test, because it seems that the world's central bankers are posturing for bail-ins around the world, and we can just see how it goes in Cyprus. See what the PSYOP part of it, how it works out.
I think that's exactly right. It's like a laboratory test case, and who really gives a crap about Cyprus in the United States?
Nobody. They don't even know where it is.
Oh, right. I mean, I asked some people, where's Cyprus? And they say, I don't know. Isn't it next to Spain and Portugal?
Or in
They
Africa.
have no idea.
Yeah.
And Jay Leno used to expose the ignorance of a lot of people. He once asked, what's the capital of Germany? And somebody said France. I mean, it's appalling.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the Cyprus story. And there's a lot more to it, but you know, it's also a bit of a tax haven, and a lot of shady type people stay there, but a lot of really good Britons stay there as retirees, and they're troubled because their banks are not safe right now. And where are they supposed to put their pensions from a legitimate British source?
Yeah.
Okay, that's Cyprus. Next is Syria. When Syria hit, my first reaction was, well, it looks like they want to interfere with the Iran pipeline, the Iran natural gas pipeline. And once it got to the Syrian port, it was going to be hooked into the Gazprom network and supply Europe. So it looks like they're going to interfere with that. And then I learned of the second motive of the large Tamar platform area oil discovery that went north to Lebanon and Syria. Israel wants it all.
Yeah.
And they don't mind dropping bombs. It's okay. It's part of business. Bombs and war are part of business.
It's why sometimes we talk about on this program the whole model of, I think it's so important to talk about this nobody talks about the competitive world, that we live in a competitive model. It's almost assumed, and nobody really discusses it. And that there's another model of cooperation, which seems, as we're talking about these geopolitical dynamics, seems so far away that we can actually all be working together to achieve it's dog eat dog, it's profit, it's winning, it's money and power, and it makes my stomach turn.
Well, it's the fascist business model. Dan, we've got a huge fascist influence and thread through the U.S. system ever since they killed Kennedy.
Yeah.
I think the fascists from New York and Wall Street and Langley, I think they removed Kennedy. He has a quote. He said, "There's a sinister plot to enslave Americans, and I intend to expose it."
Yeah.
He was dead a few months later.
Yeah.
He had a plan to bring back the silver standard for the dollar.
Exactly.
He was killed.
Yeah.
He had a plan to disintegrate and just take apart the entire Central Intelligence Agency. He was killed.
Yeah.
The fascist theme goes thick, and I believe that there was a deal cut where Kennedy was assassinated, Richard Nixon would be resurrected from the political dead, and he would install Kissinger as Secretary of State as they abandon the gold standard. That is the sequence that I believe the fascists deployed. And then you had all kinds of Kissinger meetings with Latin American countries that were fascist, including Argentina, and he also met with the current Pope. These guys are all fascist. Fascist model has a very simple theme. We win, we kill you, you lose.
Yep.
We win, we steal, you're defrauded, you're the enemy, we don't care if you're the ally, screw you, we win, you lose. That's the fascist business model in colloquial terms.
Yeah.
So in Syria, of course there's a lot of regime problems with Assad. Of course, there's a lot of harsh treatment of Sunnis there. The Alawites and the Sunnis and I don't get into all that stuff in my newsletter. What I focus on is the pipeline was interrupted. The schedule is delayed for the port facility that would ship that gas from Iran, a gigantic source of oil and gas. They've got something like 30% of the world's reserves of oil and gas. Iran does. I mean, I don't know why it's there. It just is. Mm-hmm. So the Iran pipeline was interrupted to go to Syria, which would have supplied Europe, and the United States managed to cut off the Iran pipeline development to Pakistan also, and I think both are going to be resurrected. And it's very complicated, but there's a very big theme in the Syria story of the Gazprom pipelines. And then you go to Ukraine, which is the obvious Gazprom. They have the transit routes. But what the U.S. does not maybe put into proper consideration is the Nord Stream, which is the northern pipelines from Russia to Germany and other northern European sites. They've got several liquefied natural gas, LNG facilities on the ports. Germany's already got non-Ukraine sourced gas. Now you've got the other pipeline. It's called South Stream. Goes through Bulgaria, Hungary, and Austria. Goes through Serbia. The U.S. is trying to get those leaders to block the construction, and so far a very interesting thing has happened. The political leaders in these countries are all telling the U.S. government folks in Washington what they want to hear. I call it lip service. Oh, yes, 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 Mr. Senator McCain. Yes, yes, Mr. Treasury Secretary Kerry. We will block this from those nasty Russians. And then they turn around and they go ahead and sign contracts and everything proceeds as normal.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, the first nations to be supplied, I think, will be Bulgaria and Serbia next year. 2015. Then Austria, 2016. So we've got the next 2 years South Stream coming on. We've already got North Stream that's been in function, I think, for well over a year, maybe 2 years. So Ukraine stock for their transit routes will fall 50% in value as the U.S., through its Langley mercenary killers and Soros mercenary killers, lay waste, rape, and pillage the nation of Ukraine. I'm not saying
all wars are resource wars, to remind myself.
Well, in our lifetime, that's true. Even World War II had some trade elements to it. Even World War I had some trade elements to it regarding provision of helium, where the Germans had their Zeppelins supplied with hydrogen. And how did that Hindenburg Zeppelin work out?
Yeah. So, Jim, I want to get back to some basics. We only have a few minutes left here, maybe less than 10 minutes. Let's circle back to the bubble. Why is it? I want to know from you, what's bigger, the housing market bubble, the derivative bubble? Is it the same thing? And what's the pin, or how's the bubble going to find the pin?
I think the pin is going to be some major banks breaking, failing. I point to the bank in Portugal that failed a couple weeks ago. They had a big bond decline, a big downgrade by Moody's, S&P, and those. This Portuguese bank is called Espírito Santo, Banco Espírito Santo. It's not a small bank, but it's not a household name either. The family ownership is now gone. It's in receivership. And what I'm hearing is that a couple of big French banks are at risk for the support that they offered this Portuguese bank. And if a French bank goes down, you could see a domino effect from a giant German bank. So Portugal and its one bank failure might affect France and Germany. This is how the contagion works. You've got these big banks that are pretty much all lashed together, like in old colonial times, the sailors would tie ropes around their waists, around a different sailor, another sailor, and then around a big mast. So nobody would get blown overboard during a storm with the heavy waves. They had to remove and lower and raise up their big sails so they wouldn't have their mast break during a storm. Well, now the same analogy holds for the big Western banks. They're all tied together now with derivatives. And you asked me which ones are big? Well, the housing market was a bubble, and the total amount of housing value, they call it the housing stock, in the United States was something like $23 trillion in 2007. So that has come down in value to maybe something like, I don't know, 18 to 20 trillion. That's pretty big. The Treasury bond bubble, let me give you a preface on the Treasury bond to show you how corrupt it is. JP Morgan has sold twice. They're the main agent for distribution of Treasury bonds. They work with the Federal Reserve. They've got a tunnel underneath, moves gold back and forth between JP Morgan and the Federal Reserve. But JP Morgan has been, and always has been, the main agent for distributing Treasury bonds, which get securitized by the Department of Treasury. It's just U.S. government debt made into a bond, sold on Wall Street, mainly with their broker of JP Morgan. Well, JP Morgan has sold twice as many Treasury bonds as were issued by the Department of Treasury.
Wow.
What about that extra $2 trillion? Should we maybe get them for fraud? No. The law doesn't apply to JP Morgan.
No.
In fact, they lied about the London whale derivative event in June, May of 2012, saying it was under $1 billion in losses. And I came out and said, no, it's probably at least 10. And now the figure they come up with is 8.9 billion. But in order to keep quiet that the derivative losses from JP Morgan on interest rate derivatives that hold up the value of the U.S. Treasury bond complex, in order to keep quiet the fact that the entire London whale losses are over 100 billion, we're seeing murdered JP Morgan London mid-level bankers.
Yeah.
Okay, the biggest common theme of the murders in London are J.P. Morgan. And now you're seeing it spread to Swiss reinsurance executives who are tied in with J.P. Morgan, mutual funds and other funds, treasury type funds. All right, so the treasury bond bubble is the largest asset bubble now, I believe, in history. Not so much in volume, but in importance, because you've got all kinds of foreign nations holding their reserves for their banking, their collateral reserves that justify their entire credit operations. The foreign banking systems are built on treasury bond reserves. And we've got a treasury bond bubble that has a value of 17 or 18 trillion that's being supported by a printing press using unsterilized bond monetization and a lot of other lies that support the treasuries with absent demand and $1 trillion a year in new supply. And the Belgian bulge is showing one of their lies. Yeah. It has gone from, I think, about 40 billion in late 2013 and went over 400 billion in the space of really just 6 or 7 months. So the Belgians really hold $500 billion in treasury bonds? I don't think so. So the Fed is clearly getting the help of Draghi and the Euro Central Bank to do some other QE bond monetization so that they can lie better. There's no tapering. There's just taper talk and lying better.
You know, it seems that like as you fall down this rabbit hole and you understand the reality of what's happening, it's illusion over lie, over fantasy, over corruption, and it I mean, even who the money talk guy says that the market's rigged is coming out in the mainstream, but it sounds more and more like a Ponzi scheme. And I was actually kind of surprised that a lot of people actually don't know what a Ponzi scheme is. I think that word is thrown around and people go, "Oh, Ponzi scheme, it's fraudulent or something." But
they know what a pyramid scheme is, don't they? Try to get 3 people to give you $100, and then you find those people all go and get 9 then people, 3 among each of them, to get $100, and it's a great income stream.
Yeah.
Okay, they understand the pyramid scheme. And it might not be $100, it might just be, $10. Can you find 20 people to give you $10? And you can join the system, and then they have to go out and find 20 people to give them $10?
Right.
And it all gets passed down, and you get a percentage as it drops down to another hierarchy level. Well, people understand the pyramid scheme. Well, that's exactly what the U.S. Treasury is now, the Treasury bonds. It's a pyramid scheme. But it's all going to fall apart. Dan, it's all going to fall apart. And the basis for falling apart, I think, started when the Chinese created these yuan swap facilities. And the first one was with Brazil in 2006 or so. And that they're all over the place now. Now, Australia has it. France has one. London has one. Germany has one. Switzerland has one. All these countries have one. Australians have one. And what it means is that they settle trade between China and Australia, for instance, in yuan. They don't use a dollar anymore. So if you have enough bilateral trade settlement agreements with yuan swap facilities with China, you're going to have a significant critical mass of the world trade not done in dollar. And this is the threat to the United States. The United States, for some reason, cannot declare massive sanctions against China. And I don't really care to discuss that here because it's too big a story. But they've got 20 different nations with yuan swap facilities. And now you've got the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, which is going to encourage foreign investment banking and foreign lending to Chinese. There's never been Chinese ability to borrow, say, euros and go invest with borrowed money in financial markets or property and assets and viable companies. That's all coming. That's all coming. The Shanghai Free Trade Zone is going to be gigantic, and it's going to have rather expanded. They're going to expand the Shanghai Gold Exchange.
So what you're saying is that the infrastructure for this transition of the collapse of our pyramid Ponzi scheme is already set up. That the world has woken up. The Americans haven't, but the world has woken up, and they've set up their networks to essentially replace our system.
Yes, and the battleground is going to be fought with RMB hubs. Now, I'd like to explain briefly what that is. RMB is the three-letter word for renminbi.
Renminbi, yes.
It means, in Chinese, it means people's money. So they've got the Chinese yuan, which they like to call the renminbi because it's what they call people's money. It's like a communist name for the yuan. Okay, people's money. People's money. Okay, people's everything. People's Republic of China. Okay, people's money. Okay, the RMB is the symbol. I mean, here the big talk in Costa Rica is what banks are offering RMB accounts. Any? The answer is none. But there's talk of one Chinese that will do conversion of dollars and conversion of euros and conversion of local currency in Costa Rica to Chinese yuan. Okay, well, that's fine. Now there's a huge battle going on. Toronto has an RMB hub. So they're in North America. I'm told that Vancouver is going to make an RMB hub. I'm also guaranteed by my source that the United States will not have an RMB hub. London and Frankfurt, Germany are the big battleground now for RMB hub. At an RMB hub, two functions take place. One is currency conversion. British pounds, euros, they must be converted to Chinese yuan. Okay, or the other direction. In Frankfurt, it's euros, it's dollars, converted to Chinese yuan. Fine. That's what they do on the currency front. The RMB hubs also do something else, and it has to do with investment banking. For instance, the Chinese government might say, well, we're going to devote just 20 billion here, but we want to sell it to European investors of Chinese government debt. And we're going to sell it in RMB, in the Chinese yuan currency. So RMB-based Chinese government debt sold in Germany, brokered in Frankfurt to German and Swiss and other investors in Central Europe. Okay, that's a big deal. Now you've also got the other way around. McDonald's, the U.S. fast food, junk food, crap food store chain. I can't get enough adjectives in there. McDonald's Corporation already sells a corporate bond in the Chinese currency.
Wow.
Yeah, they're called dim sum bonds.
One last question, Jim, because we're almost out of time. Are bail-ins, and for those of the listeners who don't know what a bail-in is, it happened in Cyprus. It's where the bank takes your money in your account. Are bail-ins coming to the United States?
Well, let me qualify that. In Cyprus, I think they took 30% of certain bank accounts.
Yeah.
It's a tax.
Yeah.
It's what they say is to recapitalize the troubled bank. Are they coming to the United States? I tend to think not, but if we have a major false flag event like 9/11, which was done basically by Wall Street, Langley, and a small ally on the southeast corner of the Mediterranean. If we have another massive false flag attack, what they might do is force a ripple contagion that destroys 20 to 200 U.S. banks. And to recapitalize and restart them, they might do a 30% bail-in confiscation on your accounts. So my advice to people is to keep a minimum amount of money in your bank account for operating your household expenses and have a maximum sized account in gold and silver, coins and bars. And if it's large enough, have a vault facility outside the United States and outside Canada to hold it.
Jim, Willie, we are out of time. thank you for the interview. You're a wealth of knowledge. I've followed some of your predictions. You've been spot on. And we appreciate your time today on Counterculture Radio.
Well, it's nice you said I was spot on a lot of forecasts, because I had a hate mail on Wednesday saying that all my correct forecasts were fabrications.
Well, there's all kinds out there. But
yeah, I think he was a Langley hired troll.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt it. I think the level of disinformation and propaganda out there is not only far underestimated, but I don't even think most people are aware that it exists. But it's absolutely a reality in our country.
It's astonishing. Well, it's a pleasure being on, and I hope people go to the Hat Trick Letter subscription. They can find it on goldenjackass.com. There are 2 newsletters. I'm sorry, there's 1 newsletter, but 2 publications each month. One's the Global Money War report that I described, but the other one is a lot more ground level material having to do with it's the golden currency report. So 2 reports each month, and it's a lot of work, but it's a labor of love, and I think it's a valuable service. And many people don't want to know what's going on, but for the growing multitude that do,
yeah.
Hat Trick Letter, I think, could be very valuable for people.
I will link that below this archived show so that people can connect to it.
Very good. All right. Well, it's a pleasure being on, Dan.
All right. Be well.